What are the challenges and rewards of narrating Palestine from the perspective of an outsider who has integrated with Palestinian society? Welcome to Connections, the Arab Studies Institute interview program on current events, policy questions, and new ideas. I'm Mouin Rabbani, and for this episode, we're delighted to be speaking with Alison Glick and Nora Murad. Alison Glick is a writer and activist currently based in Philadelphia. She previously lived in the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and Yarmouk camp in Syria, working as a teacher, human rights researcher, and freelance writer. Her first novel, The Other End of the Sea, was published this month by Interlink Books. Nora Murad is a writer and is a scholar and activist who writes about international aid, community philanthropy, and life under military occupation. Her work has appeared in The Guardian, Al-Jazeera.net, Mondo Weiss, and various academic and professional publications. She co-authored Rest in My Shade, a poem about roots, and is the editor of I Found Myself in Palestine, both also published by Interlink Books. Her tween novel is set in Jerusalem and will come out next year. Alison Glick and Nora Murad, it's a real pleasure to welcome you to Connections. I'd like to begin by exploring your personal journeys. How did each of you end up in Palestine? Was this a personal or political journey, or were the personal and political two sides of the same coin? Alison, perhaps we can begin with you and also take this opportunity to congratulate you on the publication of The Other End of the Sea.
Thanks so much, Mouin. I really appreciate it. For me, it was a personal journey that became political, but that eventually ended up being, as you put it, both sides of the same coin. I was in high school when I first went to the region. I spent a summer in Israel, and during that time, I got a whiff of the racism in the country, but didn't have, as a 17-year-old, the political and historical analysis and language to really understand what was going on. So when I went back after graduating from high school and spent 6 months on a kibbutz, that's when I would say the apartheid nature of the state really began to sink in. And I came back to the United States, started university in March of 1982. 3 months later, the Israelis invaded Lebanon. There was the siege of Beirut. Sabra and Shatila massacre happened. I started meeting Palestinians and other Arabs, international students at university, reading Said and Noam Chomsky. It all just really rocked my world. So I had this transformation that ended up with my studying Middle East history. And as soon as I graduated from university, I went back to the region, this time to live in the West Bank. I spent 3 years in the West Bank in Gaza, and then 3 years in Yarmouk camp, as you mentioned, after I married a Palestinian from Gaza who went into exile.
And this was all during the 1980s, I believe.
Yes, I was there. My first summer there was in 1980, and then I lived in Palestine and Syria from 1986 to 92, and came back to the United States at that point in 1992. So that was my trajectory and how it all became intertwined, the personal and the political, as it almost always is.
It often is. You're quite right. And Nora, what about your trajectory? Did it follow a very similar path to Alison's? Were there, let's say, elements that set it apart?
Well, I would say my journey has been at first political and then continued to be political while also becoming personal. I grew up in a family of social justice activists in California, and I think as a family we were quite involved in working against racism and for social justice for immigrants and unhoused people. And that kind of led me in college to be interested in the anti-apartheid movement. That was the South African apartheid that we were concerned about at the time. And I decided I wanted to see it for myself. That's kind of my personality. I want to see something if I'm going to really commit myself to it. And I traveled towards South Africa via my host family in France, who diverted me to Israel. They thought that South Africa would be dangerous, and they had friends they wanted to send me to in Israel, and they bought me a non-refundable ticket. When I think back at how significant it was, that ticket was non-refundable and how that changed my entire life, it's pretty amazing. But somehow, because it was non-refundable, I just went there. I had, of course, as a Jew growing up, heard about Israel, but my family were not Zionists. I didn't really know much at all. I didn't really understand there was a conflict, but it was immediately apparent to me that something was very wrong. I spent 6 weeks there in Israel and went back to Los Angeles, changed my major to Middle East studies, and ended up registering for a study abroad year in Cairo, followed by a second year abroad in Jerusalem. So different but similar. In between my 2 years abroad, I met my Palestinian husband, and that was like 35 years ago or something, of course, made the politics continue, but also added the personal dimension. We also lived in Palestine and raised our 3 daughters there in Jerusalem and Ramallah over about 13 years. And I worked and did activism work while I was there, and since then as well.
And what I find interesting about both your stories is that it was very much influenced by actually spending time there. Because when I think back about many of your peers growing up during the same period, they could, on the one hand, have very progressive politics, but then also often make an exception for Israel. Whereas in your case, what sets you apart, I think, is physically witnessing the situation that existed on the ground. In your views, did this have kind of a disproportionate impact that might not have had that impact if you would have been simply watching it on TV or reading about it? Alison, maybe I can start with you again.
Sure, absolutely. Especially as a naive young teenager traveling around Israel, not really understanding what I was seeing. The first time I went to a Palestinian village inside Israel and saw the Jim Crow-like conditions that citizens, supposedly equal citizens of the state, were living in, compared to what I saw the summer before when living in a Jewish town, I was just shocked. I didn't have that political language, but all I could think was Jim Crow South. I knew that much, and I knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. And I also knew that I hadn't been told something, maybe a lot of something. So, there's a saying that I picked up along the way. I don't certainly take credit for it. What you see, you cannot unsee. And what you, of course, do with what you see is ultimately, the important thing. But that was an education in many, many ways. And it really did change the trajectory of my life. I think it's fair to say.
And Nora, what I find interesting about what Alison just said is, she went to a Arab village and a Jewish town within Israel. I mean, one only needs to reflect on the concept of Arab village and Jewish town. But nevertheless, that this transformation occurred as a result of things she saw and experienced only within Israel's borders. It wasn't because she went to Gaza or the West Bank. And I'm wondering, in your case, was it similar, or did you also, during that first visit, go to the occupied territories, for example?
I did. It was different then, but I don't think it was the difference between the Palestinian areas and the Jewish areas that struck me. I don't remember, it was a long time ago, all the details of it, but what I remember so vividly was my first experience being almost constantly and relentlessly sexually harassed. I have never felt so unsafe, physically unsafe in my life as I did those first 6 weeks that I was in Israel. And when I would at youth hostels comment on it, the first thing people would say was he Arab or Jewish? And I was like, I don't know. How am I supposed to know?
Right?
How am I supposed to know? And then they'd say, well, was he speaking Arabic or Hebrew? And I would say, I don't know. How am I supposed to know? And I think I was just really, really struck by why this was so very important to everybody. It only took a little bit more probing and research for me to understand for the first time that I was implicated. I had always felt implicated in racism as a white person in the United States, and acted on that feeling of responsibility by doing anti-racism work. It was in Israel that I felt implicated as a Jew, and maybe switched or adjusted my social justice priorities so that while I'm still a very multi-issue person, Palestine does take quite a high priority for me as a human being, as a US taxpayer, as a Jew, and now as the mother of Palestinian Muslim girls, which is, a whole new level or kind of entrenchment, if you will, in the situation now.
And Nora, if I can continue with you on a different subject now. You edited a book called "I Found Myself in Palestine," in which about 20 authors discuss what you term the complexities of being a foreigner in Palestine. Why did you feel the need to produce this book?
Well, I think I felt a need to write and think through and to understand my own story, and quickly realized that I didn't want to do it by myself. There were interesting commonalities, but also profound differences between my experience as a foreigner and other foreigners that I knew who lived in Palestine or for whom Palestine was an important part of their lives. And
because if I can just interrupt, the authors you collect in this volume really come from all over, with an entire range of backgrounds in every sense of the term.
Absolutely. They're from all over the world. They have lots of different relationships to Palestine. Some work, some are part of Palestinian families. Some have a religious connection. But I think what ultimately was the qualification that that got somebody into the book is that they themselves were transformed by Palestine. Because I think in the beginning, what was clear was that none of us wanted to speak on behalf of Palestinians or to have Palestine perceived through our lenses. We were very aware of the risk of doing that, the harm that that would cause. And in order to resist that possibility, we did not write about Palestine. We wrote about ourselves and how we were transformed by Palestine, not how Palestine was somehow affected by us. So that was a little twist. And I think,
yeah. So if you could perhaps clarify a little what you mean when you say we were transformed by Palestine. Are you speaking about personal experiences, changes in political perspective, career trajectories?
all of those things. But what's a common thread through everybody's story is that with Palestine, there's a point at which you can, it's what Alison said, things that are seen can't be unseen. The hegemonic narrative of Palestine is such that when we see things more clearly, when we see through that, attempt to mystify reality, it becomes, in some ways, kind of lonely, really. You can't quite ever talk to people who you knew before, who don't see it the way you do, quite in the same way, and they don't see you in the same way. It is transformational, I think, politically, intellectually, and personally in that way. I think that's something that we all shared as foreigners who had been transformed.
And Alison, you initially drafted an autobiography, but then upon the recommendation of your publisher at Interlink, you transformed it into a novel, the one that's just out called The Other End of the Sea. Could you tell us a bit about your novel, and also why is it a novel rather than an autobiography at the end of the day?
Sure. Well, first, just a little bit about the book. It's a love story, writ large, and the through line of the book is this relationship between Rebecca and Zane. Rebecca is initially called Becky in the book, and at which point she becomes Rebecca is, I think, something for readers to think about. But anyway, so it's a through line of a love story, off of which I hang the backstories of Zane and Rebecca, their families, of course, their personal histories, their experiences that lead them to meet, I guess you could say. And eventually, of course, they marry. Zane goes into exile, and they end up in Damascus, in Yarmouk.
That rings a bell.
It does, doesn't it? So, and it's about how their relationship is impacted by all of the events surrounding their relationship. Exile, living in a refugee camp, withstanding the political turmoil that's unfolding around them. And then they have a daughter. And the impact on a relationship for even the strongest of marriages is such that it doesn't bode well for their future as a couple. But somehow they remain a family. And I don't want to give too much away, but in my view,
buy and read the book. I'll
read the book, and you.
I very strongly recommend it.
So that's a little bit of a summary, and to answer your other question and to relate why a memoir became a novel. One of the goals I have with this book is to get it into the hands of people who are not already converted, so to speak, who don't already understand the realities in Palestine the way that I think we all do. Because I think that's really important. I thought it was interesting that one of your earlier shows, Zach Foster, said the same thing about why he wrote his book or his dissertation in the way that he did. Anyway, I think it's important to speak beyond the choir. So when my editor suggested fictionalizing it, I first kind of freaked out because I never saw myself as a fiction writer. But then he said, Alison, more general readers will be reached by a novel set in the Middle East than by a piece of nonfiction about the Middle East. And that got my attention.
Right.
So once I started actually doing it, thinking about how to do it, I realized that I could do a lot of things in fiction that I couldn't necessarily do in nonfiction, that the narrative really could open up, and that people who know very little about the region could begin to identify with the characters and identify with their situation, because maybe they can identify with the story of, a multicultural relationship or intercultural relationship, with, a struggling marriage and how you deal with that when you have children, with unfair and unjust and often cruel immigration practices, right? So I think there are ways to, I also wanted to protect the identities of the people whose lives intersected with mine, who fed the narrative of those relationships from which I draw very heavily in the book. So that was important, and fictionalization obviously helped me to do that. And ultimately, I found the process freeing. I found that I could experience a kind of creative thrill that I never had before by creating narrative arcs for these characters. And in one instance, again, I'm not going to go into many details, creating arcs that make inanimate objects characters in the story, which is one part of the story that I absolutely love and was not there originally. So it was rewarding in a way that I didn't anticipate. And I hope it will be educational for people who would not otherwise have read my memoir.
Well, that it certainly is, and it's really fascinating how you describe the process and the transformation from your memoir into a novel. And if I could now turn to you, Nora, with a slightly different question. You're now completing a tween novel set in Jerusalem, and what are the complexities of an adult writing such a novel, and the added dimension of setting it in Jerusalem?
Well, that's a great question. The novel is actually set both in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and in Jerusalem, writing for an English-speaking audience and probably mostly a US-based audience. It's really a literary trick, I guess, to start in the US and kind of paint the picture that a US reader would be familiar with, and then have that person travel to the Middle East and see things then through new eyes. In the case of this book, it was written while my kids were absolutely obsessed with not only the Harry Potter books, but also the Percy Jackson books, which are grounded in mythology and culture, but also magic. And because my kids loved magic and loved books, and I wanted my kids to love my books, I also integrated magic.
You just gave it away.
into this story as well. So it starts with a Palestinian American girl who was born in Cambridge, whose parents moved to Cambridge as students and then stayed. And her backstory is my daughter's backstory, where here in Newton, Massachusetts, as a Palestinian American, she felt that just saying that she was Palestinian was perceived as threatening or confrontational or even violent. And her struggle in this town where I live in Newton, Massachusetts, to try to help adults and kids, but the folks around her in her school understand how racism and Islamophobia affected her ability to be happy and to learn in the school setting became the backstory for the character. So the girl is in Cambridge. She is treated poorly at her school and switches schools, wanting to be invisible, wanting not to be Palestinian, which is something I did see sometimes in my kids at various times in various places. And then in her desire to escape being Palestinian, she ends up in Palestine through magic, but not, but she is in Palestine in the life she would have had if her parents had never moved. So she's there, but her parents are there and her sisters are there and her grandparents who she had never met and her aunts and uncles who she had never met were all there. And she has some experiences there that are exciting and scary and belonging and no belonging and all of that, ends up accidentally transporting back and learning how the portal works. And once you know how the portal works, you have to choose. And that's really the whole rest of the book, is how do you choose between two places, between two versions of yourself, between two places that are both affirming in some ways, but also frightening in some ways. And so the book ends up being not just a coming of age story about a girl finding her bicultural identity, but really specifically a Palestinian girl learning how to advocate for herself as a Palestinian and to hold her classmates, her teachers and administrators accountable for an anti-racist education.
Well, if she succeeds in holding administrators accountable, it really is a magical book. And it will be published by Interlink as well, I believe.
Yes.
Do you already have a title, or are we getting ahead of ourselves?
Well, we have about 10 different titles to choose from, but anybody who's listening who wants to weigh in, I think it is about time to go for a vote.
Great.
The girl's name's Ida. And so one of the possible titles is Ida Returns, because in fact, she does return in so many different ways through the book.
Very to the point, I should add, Ida Returns. I'd like to return now once again to your personal experiences. You're both American Jewish women who married into Palestinian families and for a time at least also lived in Palestine, and in Alison's case, in Syria as well. Did being American and Jewish in this context produce particular challenges, difficulties, privileges, responsibilities, perhaps a combination of these factors? Alison, if I could turn to you first.
Sure. In terms of difficulties while living there, the main reactions or challenges I had that were difficult to deal with sometimes would be from Israelis, particularly Israeli soldiers, because I think that they would often be confused or angry as to, why is someone with the last name Glick here? You're not supposed to be here.
Wrong side of the tracks.
Wrong side of the tracks. And I think that, there was somehow threatened by it. I don't know. I mean, there was a lot of different reactions. And of course, they have them because they are, prisoners of their own narrative that wrongly says that, Jews live here and Palestinians live here, and as if there was not this rich, long history of Christians and Jews and Muslims and others living together in this land. So that was the most challenging thing, and it took different forms. Of course, though as a Jew and as an American, I was afforded a lot of privileges, mostly mobility. I could get in and out of places that, or I used to be able to get in and out of places that Palestinians cannot. You know, to this day in visits, I reap the benefits of that privilege, of course. And so, but responsibility is, I mean, I guess I would just echo what I said earlier. I feel it is my responsibility to speak out about what I saw, to be an activist, and as a writer, to bear witness to the truth that I saw through, in this case, Rebecca's eyes. So a lot of responsibility comes with that privilege, absolutely. And it's part of why I describe myself in the way that I do. It's not just as a writer, but as also as an activist.
And Nora?
Well, when I first became involved with Palestine in the way old days, like before and during the first Intifada, there were so few foreigners there. I think Palestinians all knew if you're there in solidarity. So
Right.
it really wasn't a question or a concern either about being American or being Jewish at pretty much any point.
I'll interrupt you, Nora, to say I think it's a really important point because I recall that very well, because all the careerists and opportunists, if we can call them that politely, came much later. But nevertheless, the reason I interrupted you is because you have this very humorous anecdote in the introduction to your book, where you're trying to cross the Manara, the main square in Palestine, because it's being obstructed by Israeli soldiers on top of one of the main buildings. And when you explain to a passerby, you know, or you ask for his assistance and he asks you where you're from and you say you're American, he says, well, you're the reason you're having this issue.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean when I say I felt welcome and totally comfortable in Palestine in the early days, I don't mean that folks didn't know what the US was doing and consider me to have a responsibility to educate and advocate and be active for a change in US policy. Of course they did, but the fantasy that some people have here in the United States that a Jew is going to be singled out or threatened, or that it would be dangerous. There's just not at any point in my 35 plus years of experience that I felt uncomfortable as a Jew. Now, you raised the important point that I wanted to make about the difference between being a foreigner in the old days, where everyone knows you're there in solidarity, and being a foreigner now, where it's so important that I, for example, distinguish myself from those international aid actors who are careerists, opportunists, who are there for their own advancement, financial or career advancement. So I think that being a foreigner has a credible and a genuine, yeah. It's much more complicated now. You have to really distinguish yourself. That still being said, the major problem that I have being a Jew is, as Alison said, it's not with Palestinians, it's with Jews in the United States, also with Israelis, but I'm here now where the whole discussion and the whole weaponization of anti-Semitism is being wielded both against Palestinians and other Palestinian solidarity activists, but very, very much against Jews like me who identify as anti-Zionist. And these attacks are, and the definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, is actually being used to try to define folks like me out of Judaism.
Well, I'm glad you raised that point, because that was going to be my next question, which is how you've experienced the current campaign by Israel and its apologists to delegitimize any opposition to its actions and policies, including, as you mentioned, by Jews as anti-Semitism. And I wanted to ask not only what you think of this campaign, but whether it's affected you personally. And Nora, you're basically saying this campaign is being kind of used, for lack of a better term, to excommunicate you.
Yeah, that's what I feel. I mean, if they say, which they do say, that to attack Israel is to attack Jews, what they mean by that is that Israel is an expression of Judaism. So then what am I? Right? I'm like,
Or if you're anti-Zionist, you can't be a Jew.
No. I mean, it's really, I think when we look back 10, 20, 30 years from now, I think we'll look now at this, these forces as a turning point, not just in Palestinian history, but in Jewish history. Could
you expand on that a little?
I think the idea, how do I say this? The idea that I am less of a Jew or a bad Jew because I believe in equality and human rights and dignity for Palestinians is so offensive and so evil. It can't but drive a wedge between Jews. It's just too. We can't exist as this. This is too big of a rift to have this community stay together this way, especially when the Jewish identified institutions, authorize themselves to speak on behalf of all Jews, just like Israel also authorizes itself to speak on behalf of all Jews.
And Alison, what are your thoughts and experiences in this regard?
Well, my own personal experience is, I think most of the negative reactions that I get these days, because I'm not part of a religious community, in terms of religiously being observant, are just, random social media abuse, things that I'm sure Palestinians experience in a much more dangerous level. But I would just point, for example, just this past weekend's New York Times Sunday Magazine had a long essay or a long article report about rabbinical students who are speaking out against Israeli policies. They issued a very powerful letter during the most recent attack on Gaza in May, calling the situation apartheid, speaking in terms of human rights abuses, etc. And the backlash against them, rabbinical students, was swift and fierce. And couple examples from the article, immediately one of the students' necessary internships to complete the course as a rabbi, as I understood it, was revoked. And there was this amazing quote from an older rabbi who said, "If I die tomorrow, may none of the signatories of this letter take my place." I mean, it's very amazing in many respects. But I think I'd like to sort of frame this in a larger way. I think the really important point to understand about these personal slanders, whether they're against Jews or non-Jews, and the weaponization of anti-Semitism, which, by the way, only weakens the struggle against real anti-Semitism, which is really rooted in white supremacy in its most lethal form, I say, is changing the conversation. People who support Israel's policies, they cannot win when the conversation is centered on what is really happening on the ground. That no credible observer of that cannot say the Israelis are the occupiers. It's the Palestinians who have this, legitimate struggle for freedom, dignity, equality, self-determination. And the more apparent that is to the rest of the world, and I think it is becoming more apparent because of, social media, films, etc., the louder and more bold and obnoxious these attempts to distract must become, right? So, so here we find ourselves in this, today in this situation with these, Orwellian definitions of anti-Semitism, as Nora was saying, and legal actions that really turn civil and human rights work on its head. Accusations of terrorism against ice cream companies. I mean, on some level, it's ridiculous and almost laughable, except that I believe
serious.
These tactics are steadily making their way into the deeper fabric, political and social fabric of this country and many others. They're being normalized, these tactics. Right. And I think, it's becoming very clear that activists, writers, etc., in this country are beginning to suffer in the same way that those who have been Palestinian activists for a long time have. And another point I would make is that Israel has a history of pioneering instruments of repression. And that's not to say that this country and the rest of the world doesn't have a bloody history of repression. God knows that's true. But I think that Israel has kind of carved out its own special niche in this way, that from which it profits quite handsomely, politically and financially. And you can trace this back to their pioneering use of drones, killer drones in particular, the support that they gave to apartheid South Africa in developing its nuclear program, the support for repressive, bloody regimes in Central and South America, right? So
a light unto the nations.
A light unto the nations in ways you can hardly imagine. So, I think it's important to think of this in very broad terms, because this isn't just about personal ramifications for individuals, although that happens and it's abhorrent. It's about a larger political development, societal development that I think we really need to start paying attention to.
Well, on that note, one reason I was so interested to speak with both of you is because I think it's fair to say that for people of your generation and your background, your personal and political trajectories are quite unusual and not easily found. Whereas if you look at the current generation up and coming, it would be perhaps even more difficult to find people who are your mere opposites. That's an exaggeration, but I'm wondering whether you draw hope from seeing what appears to be the very significant transformation over the course of one generation in attitudes to these issues to which you've devoted so much of your life and activism. Nora, maybe to start with you.
I'm sure Alison will have much more to say on this. I am a little bit heartened by being able to speak a little bit more freely. Not even sure I believe what I'm saying. Yeah, I see and I read and I hear that younger people, and including younger Jews, are engaging more with criticism of Zionism and understanding history better. But I really want to see that translated into political action. I want Palestinians and Arabs to be fully considered within anti-racist movements, not marginalized or second class. And I don't know, it's a little too soon for me to be quite that hopeful, but maybe soon.
One hopes. And you, Alison, your
Well,
thoughts?
maybe,
Am I
sure.
if you compare, your generation to your daughters, do you see kind of an important shift underway?
Yeah, I think maybe because I was trained as a historian, I take a longer view. And, I think about as a college student, decades ago, it was, I mean, you couldn't even use the word Palestinian really without struggling for and that becoming the issue. Or, I mean, I'm sure you both know this story. I mean, Noam Chomsky used to have an armed guard. I think the same thing for Edward Said after talks, 20, 30 years ago, 10 years ago, maybe. And now it's really, I mean, in many ways, the struggle for rights, for Palestinian rights, has become a kind of cause célèbre on college campuses. Right. It's, I think in many ways, has been integrated or is integrating into other movements for social justice. And that's by and large because of young Palestinian grassroots activists and their allies. It doesn't mean, though, that the fight's over, right? I mean, I always remind myself of the Frederick Douglass quote. I hope I get it right. Power concedes nothing without a fight. And that's to me, that's the course
without
of
a demand, I think, if I'm not
without
mistaken.
a demand. Yeah, I always get that part wrong. Thank you. And that's our charge, right? Those of us who have seen and cannot unsee, those of us who feel it's our responsibility, whether you're a Jew or not, to speak up. Those of us who, like Nora, comes from a family of anti-racist and social justice activists. This is part of that history. And, I do think that we have to recognize whether or not it will change in a couple of years. I mean, we have people in the halls of Congress who are saying this is apartheid, who are saying
that's a very significant change.
We need, we're not going to, who are advocating for cutting aid to Israel. What happened to, is it NGO, that the spyware company being blacklisted?
NSO.
NSO, sorry. NGO, NSO. We'll let that one go. Those are significant shifts that,
Sure.
And I think that we need to give credit where credit is due, but to do so with a clear-eyed vision of the future.
Well, on that hopeful yet sobering note, Alison Glick, Nora Lester Murad, I'd like to thank you for appearing on Connections and sharing your personal and political stories, and thank you for what's been a really fascinating and interesting conversation. Thank you very much. And I just also like to remind our viewers that next week on the 18th of November, we will be speaking with Kasım'da, specialist on populism and the far right. Thank you once again.
Bye-bye. Thanks.